By the late 1990s, the Second Congo War had spiraled into chaos, drawing in 9 nations and countless rebel groups. Fueled by political betrayal, ethnic tensions, and a ruthless battle for Congo's immense resources, this was no ordinary war. It was a tragedy of epic proportions, Africa's own world war that reshaped the continent and claimed millions of lives. To truly understand the Second Congo War, we must first take a brief look at its roots in the First Congo War. This earlier conflict set the stage for what would become the deadliest confrontation since World War II. These are the events that ignited this brutal chapter of history that reverberates to this day. The First Congo War began in 1996 as Rwanda increasingly expressed concern that Hutu members of Rassemblement Democratique pour le Rwanda (RDR) militias were carrying out cross-border raids from what was then Zaire and planning an invasion of Rwanda. These mostly Hutu militias had entrenched themselves in refugee camps in eastern Zaire, where many had fled to escape the Tutsi-dominated Rwandan Patriotic Front (RPF). In the aftermath of 1994's Rwandan genocide, the Tutsi-dominated RPF government of Rwanda, which had gained power in July 1994, protested this, vague, as a violation of Rwandan territorial integrity and began arming the ethnically Tutsi Banyamulenge of eastern Zaire. The Mobutu regime of Zaire vigorously denounced this intervention, though it possessed neither the military capability to halt it, nor the political capital to attract international assistance. With active support from Uganda, Rwanda, and Angola, the Tutsi forces of Laurent Kabila moved methodically down the Congo River, encountering only light resistance from the poorly trained, ill-disciplined forces of Mobutu's crumbling regime. The bulk of Kabila's fighters were Tutsi, many of them veterans of various conflicts in the continent's Great Lakes region. Kabila himself provided credibility, largely reflecting his long-time political opposition to Mobutu and his role as a follower of Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba had been the first prime minister of the independent Congo, who had been executed by a combination of internal and external forces in January 1961, ultimately being replaced by Mobutu in 1965. Kabila had declared himself a Marxist and an admirer of Mao Zedong. He had been waging armed rebellion in eastern Zaire for more than 3 decades, though Che Guevara, in his account of the early years of the conflict, portrayed him as an uncommitted and uninspiring leader. Kabila's army began, in December 1996, a slow movement west, near the end of the Great Lakes refugee crisis, taking control of border towns and mines and solidifying control. There were reports of massacres and of brutal repression by the rebel army. A UN human rights investigator published statements from witnesses who claimed that Kabila's Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, ADFLC, had committed massacres, with the advancing army killing as many as 60,000 civilians. The ADFLC strenuously denied this claim. Roberto Garreton stated that his investigation in the town of Goma turned up allegations of disappearances, torture, and killings. He quoted Moise Nyarugabo, an aide to Mobutu, as saying that such casualties should be expected in wartime. Kabila's forces, with support of Rwanda, launched an offensive in early October 1996 in South Kivu and demanded that the Kinshasa government surrender. The rebels took Kasenga on 27 March 1997. The government denied the rebels' success, starting a long pattern of false statements from the defense minister on the progress and conduct of the war. Negotiations were proposed in late March, and on 2 April, a new prime minister of Zaire, Etienne Tshisekedi, a longtime rival of Mobutu, was installed. Kabila, by this point in control of roughly 1/4 of the country, dismissed this as irrelevant and threatened to Tshisekedi that if he accepted the post, he would have no part in a new government. The ADFLC made consistent progress in its advance from the east throughout April 1997, and by May, its troops had reached the outskirts of Kinshasa. Mobutu fled Kinshasa on the 16th of May, and the liberators entered the capital without serious resistance. Mobutu fled the country and died in exile in Morocco 4 months later, Kabila proclaimed himself president on 17 May 1997, immediately ordering a violent crackdown to restore order and began attempting a reorganization of the nation. What do you think would have happened if Mobutu had remained in power? Would Congo have taken a different path? Or was Kabila's rise the beginning of hope? Or the start of even greater turmoil? Subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments. Start your comment with "I subscribe" for a chance to have it highlighted and featured in our next video. When Kabila gained control of the capital in May 1997, he faced substantial obstacles to governing the country. He renamed the state from Zaire to Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. In addition to political jostling among various groups seeking gain power and an enormous external debt, his foreign backers proved unwilling to leave when asked. The conspicuous Rwandan presence in the capital rankled many Congolese, who began to see Kabila as a pawn of foreign powers. Tensions reached new heights on 14 July 1998, when Kabila dismissed his Rwandan Chief of Staff, James Kabarebe, replacing him with a native Congolese, Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, born 1997, Celestin Kifwa. Although this move chilled what was already a troubled relationship with Rwanda, Kabila softened the blow by making Kabarebe the military advisor to his successor. 2 weeks later, Kabila reversed to his previous decision, thanking Rwanda for its help and ordering all Rwandan and Ugandan military forces to leave the country. Within 24 hours, Rwandan military advisors living in Kinshasa were unceremoniously flown out. Those most alarmed by this order were the Banyamulenge Tutsi of Eastern Congo. Their tensions with neighboring ethnic groups had been a contributing factor in the genesis of the First Congo War, and they were also used by Rwanda to affect events across the border in the DRC. On 2 August 1998, the Banyamulenge in Goma erupted into rebellion. Rwanda offered them immediate assistance, and early in August, a well-armed rebel group, the Rally for Congolese Democracy, RCD, composed primarily of Banyamulenge and backed by Rwanda and Uganda, emerged. This group quickly came to dominate the resource-rich eastern provinces and based its operations in Goma. The RCD quickly took control of the towns of Bukavu and Uvira in the Kivus. The Tutsi-led Rwandan government allied with Uganda, and Burundi also retaliated, occupying a portion of northeastern Congo. To help remove the occupying Rwandans, President Kabila enlisted the aid of refugee Hutu in eastern Congo and began to agitate public opinion against the Tutsi, resulting in several public lynchings in the streets of Kinshasa. On 12th August, a loyalist army major broadcast a message urging resistance from a radio station in Bunia in eastern Congo. People must bring a machete, a spear, an arrow, a hoe, spades, rakes, nails, truncheons, electric irons, barbed wire, stones, and the like, in order, dear listeners, to kill the Rwandan Tutsis. The Rwandan government also challenged current borders by claiming a substantial part of eastern Congo as historically Rwandan. The Rwandans alleged that Kabila was organizing a genocide against their Tutsi brethren in the Kivu region. The degree to which Rwandan intervention was motivated by a desire to protect the Banyamulenge, as opposed to using them as a smokescreen for its regional aspirations after ousting Mobutu, is still being debated. In a bold move, Rwandan soldiers under the command of James Kabarebe hijacked 3 planes and flew them to the government base of Kitona on the Atlantic coast. The planes landed in the middle of the Kitona base, but the motley collection of troops there, ex-FAZ, but also Angolan UNITA elements and former Pascal Lissouba militiamen from Brazzaville, were in poor condition and in no condition to fight unless given food and weapons. They were quickly won over to the Rwandan side. More towns in the east and around Kitona fell in rapid succession as the combined RCDD, Rwandan, and rebel soldiers overwhelmed government forces amid a flurry of ineffectual diplomatic efforts by various African nations. By the 13th of August, less than 2 weeks after the revolt had begun, rebels held the Inga hydroelectric station that provided power to Kinshasa, as well as the port of Matadi, through which most of Kinshasa's food passed. The diamond center of Kisangani fell into rebel hands on 23rd August, and forces advancing from the east had begun to threaten Kinshasa by late August. Uganda, while retaining joint support of the RCD with Rwanda, also created a rebel group that it supported exclusively, the Movement for the Liberation of Congo, MLC. Despite the movement of the front lines, fighting continued throughout the country. Even as rebel forces advanced on Kinshasa, government forces continued to battle for control of towns in the east of the country. The Hutu militants, with whom Kabila was cooperating, were also a significant force in the east. Nevertheless, the fall of the capital and of Kabila, who had spent the previous weeks desperately seeking support from various African nations and Cuba, seemed increasingly certain. The rebel offensive was abruptly reversed as Kabila's diplomatic efforts bore fruit. The first African countries to respond to Kabila's request for help were fellow members of the Southern African Development Community, SADC. While officially, the SADC members are bound to a mutual defense treaty, in the case of outside aggression, many member nations took a neutral stance to the conflict. However, the governments of Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Angola supported the Kabila government after a meeting in Harare, Zimbabwe, on 19 August. Several more nations joined the conflict for Kabila in the following weeks: Chad, Libya, and Sudan. A multi-sided war thus began. In September 1998, Zimbabwean forces flown into Kinshasa held off a rebel advance that reached the outskirts of the capital, while Angolan units attacked northward from its borders and eastward from the Angolan territory of Cabinda against the besieging rebel forces. This intervention by various nations saved the Kabila government and pushed the rebel front lines away from the capital. However, it was unable to defeat the rebel forces, and the advance threatened to escalate into direct conflict with the national armies of Uganda and Rwanda. In November 1998, a new Ugandan-backed rebel group, the Movement for the Liberation of Congo, was reported in the north of the country. On 6 November, Rwandan President Paul Kagame admitted for the first time that Rwandan forces were assisting the RCD rebels for security reasons, apparently after a request by Nelson Mandela to advance peace talks. On 18 January 1999, Rwanda, Uganda, Angola, Namibia, and Zimbabwe agreed on a ceasefire at a summit at Windhoek, Namibia, but the RCD was not invited. Fighting thus continued. Outside of Africa, most states remained neutral but urged an end to the violence. On 5 April 1999, tensions within the RCD about the dominance of the Banyamulenge reached a boiling point when RCD leader Ernest Wamba, Dr. Wamba, moved his base from Goma to Uganda-controlled Kisangani to head a breakaway faction known as RCD Kisangani, which later became the Forces for Renewal. A further sign of a break occurred when President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda and Kabila signed a ceasefire accord on 18 April in Sirte, Libya, following the mediation of Libyan leader Muammar al-Gaddafi. But both the RCD and Rwanda refused to take part. On 16 May, Wamba was ousted as head of the RCD in favor of a pro-Rwanda figure, Dr. Emile Ilunga. 7 days later, the various factions of the RCD clashed over control of Kisangani. On 8 June, rebel factions met to try to create a common front against Kabila. Despite these efforts, the occupying armed forces of Uganda recreated the province of Ituri, based off of the province of Kibali Ituri, which previously existed from 1962 to 1966 in the Republic of the Congo. Perceived favoritism to the ethnic Hema by the Ugandan forces sparked the ethnic clash of the Ituri conflict, sometimes referred to as a war within a war. Nevertheless, diplomatic circumstances contributed to the first ceasefire of the war. In July 1999, the Lusaka ceasefire agreement was signed by the 6 warring countries: Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, and Uganda. And on 4 August, the MLC, the RCD, refused to sign until 31 August. Under the terms of the agreement, forces from all sides, under a joint military commission, would cooperate in tracking, disarming, and documenting all armed groups in the Congo, especially those forces identified with the 1994 Rwanda genocide. Few provisions, however, were made to actually disarm the militias. The United Nations Security Council deployed about 90 liaison personnel in August 1999 to support the ceasefire. However, in the following months, all sides accused the others of repeatedly breaking the ceasefire, and it became clear that small incidents could trigger attacks. Tensions between Uganda and Rwanda escalated as units of the Uganda People's Defense Force and the Rwandan Patriotic Army clashed in Kisangani on the morning of 7th August. Fighting broke out again between the two armies on the evening of 14th August. Fighting occurred throughout much of Kisangani, including in the airport and on major roads. The conflict lasted until 17th August, when a ceasefire was called that day. Both sides used heavy weapons during these clashes. As reported by the International Crisis Group, the fighting was a result of differences over the objectives and strategies used during the war. In November, government-controlled television in Kinshasa claimed that Kabila's army had been rebuilt and was now prepared to fulfill its mission to liberate the country. Rwandan-supported rebel forces launched a major offensive and approached Kinshasa, but were eventually repelled. By 24th of February 2000, the UN authorized a force of 5,337 troops. The United Nations organization mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, known by the French acronym MONUC, to monitor the ceasefire. However, fighting continued between rebels and government forces and between Rwandan and Ugandan forces. Numerous clashes and offensives occurred throughout the country, most notably heavy fighting between Uganda and Rwanda in Kisangani in May and June 2000. On 9 August 2000, a government offensive in Equateur province along the Ubangi River was repulsed near Libenge by MLC forces. Military operations and diplomatic efforts made by the UN, African Union, and Southern African Development Community failed to make any headway. The government initially stated that Kabila was wounded but still alive when he was flown to Zimbabwe for intensive care. The circumstances of his assassination are unclear and have been the subject of considerable rumors and disagreements. The consensus is that Kabila was shot by one of his bodyguards, the 18-year-old Rashidi Mizele, a Kadogo, child soldier. Mizele had previously been misidentified as Rashidi Kasereka. 2 days later, the government announced on state television that the desperate attempt by Zimbabwean medical personnel to save Kabila had failed and that Kabila had died from his wounds. His remains were returned for a state funeral on 26 January 2001. Shortly after the assassination, the French newspaper Le Monde published a story in which self-identified assassination plotters revealed documents and details of the plot to murder Kabila. The plotters were mainly Kadogos who had been under Kabila's command since 1996 and were aggrieved over their poor treatment. The catalyst for the assassination appeared to be the execution of 47 Kadogos accused of plotting against Kabila. The execution witnessed by Kabila took place the day before his assassination. While the role of the disgruntled Kadogos is relatively well established, there have been some attempts to argue that they were under the influence of external actors who sought to overthrow Kabila. Some Congolese officials attempted to implicate their principal enemies by alleging that the Rwandans masterminded the operation. Some observers have lent credibility to these allegations, including Al Jazeera's documentary Murder in Kinshasa, which alleges that a Lebanese diamond dealer allegedly organized the logistics of the organization. Others have speculated that the Angolans, due to Kabila's complicity in helping the Angolan rebel group UNITA channel funds through the DRC, or even the Americans, were involved in the assassination. There is, as yet, no proof that Mizele or the Kadogos were acting under orders from an external source. Joseph Kabila becomes president. By unanimous vote of the Congolese parliament, his son, Joseph Kabila, was sworn in as president to replace him. That he won the election was largely due to Robert Mugabe's backing. and the fact that most parliamentarians had been handpicked by the elder Kabila. In February, the new president met Rwandan President Paul Kagame in the United States. Rwanda, Uganda, and the rebels agreed to a UN pullout plan. Uganda and Rwanda began pulling troops back from the front line. Joseph Kabila has been described as a more adept political leader than his father. As Chris Talbot notes, an article in the Washington Post favorably contrasted Joseph Kabila, Western, educated, and English-speaking, with his father. The author of the Washington Post article writes that Joseph Kabila gave diplomats hope that things have changed, in contrast to Laurent Kabila, who stood as the major impediment to a peaceful settlement of the war launched in August 1998 to unseat him. A peace accord Laurent signed in the summer of 1999, the Lusaka ceasefire agreement, remained unfulfilled, largely because he kept staging new offensives while blocking deployment of UN peacekeepers in government-held territory. To compare, according to an analyst from the London-based Economist Intelligence Unit, the only obstruction had been Kabila because the Lusaka Accord called for the government's democratic transition, and that was a threat to his power. In April 2001, a UN panel of experts investigated the illegal exploitation of diamonds, cobalt, coltan, gold, and other lucrative resources in the Congo. The report accused Rwanda, Uganda, and Zimbabwe of systematically exploiting Congolese resources and recommended the Security Council impose sanctions. In 2002, Rwanda's situation in the war began to worsen. Many members of the RCD either gave up fighting or decided to join Kabila's government. Moreover, the Banyamulenge, the backbone of Rwanda's militia forces, became increasingly tired of control from Kigali and the unending conflict. A number of them mutinied, leading to violent clashes between them and Rwandan forces. At the same time, the Western Congo was becoming increasingly secure under the younger Kabila. International aid was resumed as inflation was brought under control. In March, the RCD Goma faction captured Moliro, a town located on the coast of Lake Tanganyika, from government forces. According to said faction, the town was shelled by government gunboats the following day in response. The capture was seen as a violation of the Lusaka ceasefire agreement.
Under the leadership of South Africa, peace talks held in that country between April and December 2002 led to the signing of a comprehensive peace agreement. The Sun City Agreement was formalized on 19 April 2002. It was a framework for providing the Congo with a unified, multi-party government and democratic elections. However, critics noted that there were no stipulations regarding the unification of the army, which weakened the effectiveness of the agreement. There were several reported breaches of the Sun City Agreement, but it has seen a reduction in the fighting. On 30th July 2002, Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo signed a peace deal known as the Pretoria Accord after 5 days of talks in Pretoria, South Africa. The talks centered on two issues. One was the withdrawal of the estimated 20,000 Rwandan soldiers in the Congo. The other was the rounding up of the ex-Rwandan soldiers and the dismantling of the Hutu militia known as Interahamwe, which took part in Rwanda's 1994 genocide and continues to operate out of eastern Congo. Rwanda had previously refused to withdraw until the Hutu militias were dealt with. Signed on 6 September, the Luanda Agreement formalized peace between Congo and Uganda. The treaty aimed to get Uganda to withdraw its troops from Bunia and to improve the relationship between the two countries. But implementation proved troublesome. 11 days later, the first Rwandan soldiers were withdrawn from the eastern DRC. On 5 October, Rwanda announced the completion of its withdrawal. MONUC,
confirmed the departure of over 20,000 Rwandan soldiers. On 21st October, the UN published its expert panel's report on the pillage of natural resources by armed groups. Both Rwanda and Uganda rejected accusations that senior political and military figures were involved in illicit trafficking of plundered resources. Zimbabwe Defense Minister Sidney Sekeramayi said the Zimbabwean military withdrew from the DRC in October 2002. But in June 2006, reporters said a 50-man force had stayed in the DRC to protect Kabila. On 17 December 2002, the Congolese parties of the Inter-Congolese Dialogue, the national government, the MLC, the RCD, the RCDAL, the RCDN, the domestic political opposition, representatives of civil society and the Mai Mai, signed the Global and All-Inclusive Agreement. The agreement described a plan for transitional governance that would have resulted in legislative and presidential election within 2 years of its signing, and marked the formal end of the Second Congo War. From the fall of Mobutu's regime to the assassination of Laurent Kabila and the fragile peace agreements that followed, the Second Congo War stands as a powerful testament to how ambition, greed, and human suffering can intertwine. Yet, even in the midst of unimaginable chaos, there were sparks of resilience, stories of communities enduring against all odds and nations striving for a fragile sense of stability. Often called the deadliest conflict since World War II, the Second Congo War claimed over 5 million lives, with most casualties caused not by bullets, but by malnutrition and disease. Despite its staggering toll, this devastating war has remained largely overlooked by international media, buried under perceptions of its complexity and the lack of global attention. It's a story that demands to be told, a story that echoes the resilience and struggles of a continent.